1,200-ton cover of the reactor suddenly blasts into the air. An ultra-powerful stream of radioactive vapor releases uranium and graphite over hundreds of yards around the plant. From the gaping hole, a spray of fire charged with radioactive particles and fusion shoots more than 3,000 feet into the sky. The most serious nuclear accident in history has just taken place.
During the night, early in the morning, I got the call around 5 a.m. I was told there's been some accident at the Chernobyl nuclear plant.
The first firemen on the scene battle the fire without adequate protective gear. They pour tons of water on this strange fire, but nothing seems capable of putting it out. They're all exposed to lethal doses of radiation. 2 men die that night. 28 more will follow in the next few months. They are the first victims of Chernobyl. By early morning, the clouds are already being contaminated by the radioactive column rising 3,000 feet into the sky. Igor Kosti was a photographer with the news agency Novosti. When a friend and a helicopter pilot offers to fly him over Chernobyl that morning, all Kosti knows is that something happened at the plant during the night. He is the first journalist to witness the gaping hole.
When we flew over the block, I opened the window of the helicopter. I didn't realize then what a big mistake that was.
The thin, translucent smoke he sees rising from the ruins is in fact highly radioactive. Kostin is one of the few Chernobyl reporters on the scene in the early hours of the accident to have survived serious exposure to radiation. This is the first picture ever taken of the breach.
Once I returned to Kiev, I processed my pictures, and I noticed the negatives were black and the colors very poor. I didn't know it yet, but the photos had been exposed to radioactivity.
At the core of the blown-up reactor, buried beneath nearly 50 feet of rubble, the graphite surrounding the nuclear fuel burns and melts the uranium. The radioactive fallout will be 100 times greater than the combined power of the 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the Kremlin, 8 hours after the explosion, Gorbachev has little information on the situation.
The first information consisted of accident and fire. Not a word about an explosion. At first, I was told there hadn't been an explosion. The consequences of such false information were particularly dramatic.
Meanwhile, clouds filled with radioactive particles are being blown north by the wind. Between the 26th and the 27th of April, they drift more than 600 miles across Russia, then over Belarus and the Baltics. On the 28th, they hit Sweden, where the rise of radioactivity is detected near one of their nuclear power plants.
The Swedish Minister of Energy phoned me on the Monday, and I was in my office in Vienna, and she told me that they had measured very much increased radioactivity near our power plant in Forsmark in the east of Sweden, and they had concluded that it must have come from abroad. Did we know anything about it?
What has happened? An explosion? A radioactive cloud? Serious contamination? It was Sweden that alerted us.
The crisis continues to grow. At the bottom of the destroyed reactor, 1,200 tons of white-hot magma continue to burn at over 5,000 degrees, sending radioactive gas and dust into the atmosphere. All of Europe is at the mercy of the winds. On the third day of the crisis, Soviet General Nikolai Antochkin leads a fleet of 80 helicopters sent from Moscow to fight the blaze and put the fire out. In those days, radioactivity was measured in units called roentgens. Normal atmospheric level is about 12 millionths of a roentgen. General Antochkin is shocked by what he finds.
Our dosimeter, the instrument for measuring radiation, only went up to 500 roentgens. The needle was going crazy. It was completely off the scale. I think there were at least 1,000 roentgens at a height of 200 meters.
Even at that altitude, just a half hour of exposure could be lethal. The strong current of radioactive hot air streaming up from the reactor makes it impossible to get closer. They will have to improvise some way of carrying out their mission.
Something needed to be done as quickly as possible. Put out the fire and seal up the reactor to be able to get close enough to do other work. It also needed to be closed up to stop the radioactive dust from spreading. It was getting blown off by the wind. We really needed to act fast.
The gigantic ballet begins. Top pilots are being rushed back from the Afghan front to fly helicopters carrying soldiers who will toss 175-pound sandbags into the blaze with their bare hands. They hope to smother the fire by filling the reactor with tons of sand and boric acid, which neutralizes radiation. The first day, 110 sorties. The next, 300. The radiation level above the reactor is over 3,500 roentgens, almost 9 times the lethal dose. Some of the pilots make up to 33 flights in a single day.
Each time they went, they received 5 or 6 roentgens. If they were slow, it was even more. After a few missions, my soldiers would go wash up and eat. After a while, they'd start throwing up.
Since the crisis began, radiation victims have been sent to Moscow's Hospital Number 6. It has the country's only service that specializes in acute radiation sickness and illnesses linked to massive doses of radiation exposure. The initial symptoms of radiation sickness, vomiting, nausea, and diarrhea, are followed by a latency period. It's only later that much more fatal symptoms appear, such as deterioration of bone marrow and burns that eat flesh down to the bone.
When they arrived at the clinic, it was very hard, psychologically speaking. They came straight from the airport. Almost all of them were young. They arrived during the latency period. They felt fine. They were all dressed alike, wearing the same pajamas. They were making jokes. But we already knew that a lot of them were going to die. 27 of them died quite quickly. They'd all received huge doses of radiation and were suffering from life-threatening burns.
For 15 years, only these first victims will be acknowledged by the authorities. But many more will confront the devastating consequences of radiation exposure because the massive battle to contain the catastrophe at Chernobyl has only just begun. One week after the explosion at Chernobyl, a massive evacuation is finally underway. The close-by town of Pripyat and the larger city of Chernobyl, roughly 4 miles from the plant, are completely evacuated. So are all the villages within a 19-mile radius. 130,000 people are moved, many of whom have already been dangerously contaminated. An 1,150 square mile area along the border of Ukraine and Belarus is abruptly evacuated and isolated from the rest of the world. Meanwhile, the radioactive cloud continues to drift over Europe. It floats over Bavaria and northern Italy. Radioactive cesium-137 and iodine-131 rain down on the south of France and Corsica. Crops and pastures are seriously contaminated. While French authorities deny its presence, the cloud reaches Great Britain and spreads into Greece. In Chernobyl, the level of radioactivity continues to climb. 6,000 tons of sand and boric acid have filled the hole. But underneath this gigantic plug, 195 tons of nuclear fuel is still burning, giving off incredible heat that is gradually melting the sand. On the surface of the plug, cracks begin to appear.
Once we plugged up the hole, the temperature started to rise. We were afraid because it could have caused another explosion. It was terrifying. Scientists came to take readings. They were very worried. They were afraid the critical temperature would be reached and it would set off a second explosion. That would have been a terrible tragedy.
The cement slab below the reactor core is heating up and in danger of cracking. The magma is threatening to seep through. The water the firemen poured during the first hours of the disaster has pooled below the slab. If the radioactive magma makes contact with the water, it could set off a second explosion even more devastating than the first. The country's top experts are called into action.
If the heat managed to crack the cement slab, only 1,400 kilograms of uranium and graphite mixture would have needed to hit the water to set off a new explosion.
The ensuing chain reaction could set off an explosion comparable to a gigantic atomic bomb.
Our experts studied the possibility and concluded that the explosion would have had a force of 3 to 5 megatons. Minsk, which is 320 kilometers from Chernobyl, would have been razed and Europe rendered uninhabitable.
We had to stop the process. If it continued, it would have been an enormous disaster. An enormous nuclear disaster.
This second explosion would have been accompanied by a terrible shockwave and a massive rise in radioactivity that could have claimed thousands of lives in a matter of hours.
Thank God it didn't happen. There were trains with over 1,000 cars in Minsk, Gomel and Kiev ready to evacuate the population.
The situation is critical. In Moscow, the State Commission decrees 2 emergency measures. First, send in a battalion of firemen to drain the water from under the reactor. They will later be declared national heroes, but will suffer from radiation sickness the rest of their lives. Second, seal the breach more effectively to bring the temperature down once and for all. In 2 days, General Antochkin's men will drop 2,400 tons of lead into the reactor.
When we started dumping lead in, the temperature went down right away. It absorbed well and sealed the hole as it melted, so there was less radiation.
But some of this lead melts when it hits the blaze and vaporizes into the atmosphere. 20 years later, traces of it can be found in the sick children of Chernobyl.
It's highly criticized today, but given the situation, there was no better solution. And all the people, military or civilians, officers or not, worked selflessly. I participated in this first stage. And I can tell you, it had to be done. It was heroism.
During this operation, 600 pilots are fatally contaminated with radiation. All of them will die. But their efforts only buy a few days. Although it has been covered over, the fire still isn't out. Flying over in helicopters isn't solving the problem. They need to get closer. Go down into the breach. But how? The blueprints of the plant reveal that the active zone can be approached through the cable and pipe tunnels, built out of thick cement. A delegation of technicians from the Kurchatov Institute venture into the labyrinth. It's tough going. Parts of the tunnels have collapsed in the explosion. They pierce through the shell of the fourth reactor with a blowtorch and stick their radioactivity detectors and thermometers in, along with cameras. The result is terrifying. The radiation levels are astronomical, and their worst fears are confirmed. The white-hot magma has cracked the cement slab and seeped into the empty basin. It is now threatening to sink even further.
There was a 5 to 10% risk of explosion. We drained the water from under the reactor, but something absolutely had to be done. Something had to be put underneath the reactor to keep the magma from seeping down. Something had to keep it from falling in.
Nothing is stopping the magma from seeping even deeper into the sandy subsoil. And beneath the reactor lies a huge store of groundwater that supplies the entire country. A new operation is launched, the story of which has never fully been told. A daring attempt to burrow beneath the reactor that will eventually claim many more lives. "17 days after the initial explosion, thousands of miners are summoned to Chernobyl from across the Soviet Union. Their mission? To approach the reactor through what is now the only possible path, underground.
Our mission was this: dig a 150-meter tunnel from the third block to the fourth, a tunnel 30 meters long. Then dig a room 30 meters long and 30 meters wide to hold a refrigeration device for cooling down the reactor.
In 1 month, 10,000 miners from Russia and the mining regions of the Ukraine are sent down into the tunnel. They're between 20 and 30 years old. Inside the tunnel, which has no ventilation, the temperature hits 120 degrees, and radioactivity is at a minimum of 1 Roentgen per hour.
We worked without any protective gear. The miners couldn't use masks because the filters would get damp after a few minutes. So everyone just took them off and kept on working without them, with our shirts off too. We drank water out of open bottles, which was really bad because the radioactive particles were ingested right into our body.
The hardest thing was the lack of oxygen and the incredible heat. It was hot, hot, hot. And we had to work really fast, at a crazy pace, faster and faster.
Battalions of 30 miners relieve each other every 3 hours, 24 hours a day. In just over a month, they dig a 500-foot tunnel, a job that in a mine would have normally taken 3 months.
The most dangerous places were not underground. There wasn't as much radiation below the reactor. But as soon as we came up, we had to run even faster.
Radioactivity at the mouth of the tunnel is 300 times higher. Not a single miner is spared from exposure. Not once are they informed of the real dangers they are facing.
Someone had to go and do it. Us or someone else. We did our duty.
The miners accomplish their mission, but the cooling system is never set up below the reactor. The underground room is finally filled with cement to solidify the structure. The official position is that each miner received 30 to 60 roentgens, but survivors claim they received up to 5 times that amount. It is estimated that a fourth of these men died before the age of 40. 2,500 lives lost that don't appear in any official statistic. The fire at Chernobyl is now being kept in check, but the breach and tons of highly radioactive rubble lie exposed to the elements. It is urgent to cover the broken structure and clean up the zone. But for that, more men will be needed. Many more men.
Добрый вечер, товарищи.
18 days after the disaster, Gorbachev finally addresses the Soviet people, launching a massive campaign in response to the emergency.
Она больно затронула советских людей. Вся страна была мобилизована.
The entire country was mobilized. No bureaucratic formalities. If someone had what we needed, we took it. No formalities. We'd worry about the cost later. We took whatever we needed. It was a frontline situation.
General Nikolai Tarakanov is sent to command the land troops.
In 1 year, 100,000 soldiers and officers passed through Chernobyl. They were all reservists. They were summoned up by top administration in their cities and sent to the front.
Military personnel or civilians, officers or simple soldiers, all of them are liquidators, a term invented for the Battle of Chernobyl. Their mission, clean up, liquidate the radioactivity. Igor Kostin was one of 5 war reporters authorized by the Kremlin to cover the battle. A first in a country that kept everything hidden. 3 of his colleagues are now dead.
There were no titles, no ministers, generals, or soldiers. No one was saying, "I'm a general, do what I say." Everyone was honestly doing what they could. And so the operation named the liquidation of the Chernobyl accident was set in motion.
100,000 troops, as well as 400,000 civilians, workers, engineers, nurses, doctors, and scientists from every Soviet republic passed through Chernobyl. The Soviet Union is waging its last major battle.
500,000 people. The troops in Chernobyl were bigger than Napoleon's, but our army got contaminated.
From the sky, helicopters drop tons of a sticky liquid dubbed Berber, a mixture that coagulates and plasters the radioactive dust to the ground. Meanwhile, brigades of liquidators are put in charge of cleaning up the zone and house by house, removing the layer of radioactive dust that covers everything. The last villages with people still remaining in the zone are evacuated. The houses are knocked down one by one and buried. Around the plant, a colossal operation is set in motion. It goes on 7 days a week without a single day off. 400,000 cubic yards of contaminated earth are bulldozed into huge ditches and covered over with cement.
This spot, around the 4th reactor, is where the most dangerous missions of the zone took place.
8 weeks after the explosion, the liquidators tackle the heart of the problem. In order to neutralize the toxic waste for the long term, And prevent it from spreading even more, the entire blown-out reactor has to be isolated. Lev Bakarov was one of the engineers who designed the enormous structure that would entirely cover the fourth reactor. A sarcophagus of steel and concrete, more than 550 feet long and 215 feet tall.
It was one of a kind, a unique project. No one had ever built such a structure in a zone this radioactive. You could only work a few minutes at a time. That had never been done before.
It is an enormous challenge. How do you build a monumental structure in a place where humans can work for only a few minutes or even just seconds at a time? This utterly new situation will require more improvisation from the liquidators and put more lives at risk. It has now been more than 12 weeks since the initial blast at block number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. To stop the deadly contamination, the final attack is launched. Construction of a massive sarcophagus that will completely cover the damaged reactor. Radioactivity in this sector is so high that only remote-controlled machines can be sent in. But people will have to get the machines into position. Workers can only stay a few minutes without receiving a fatal dose of radiation. With each second, their lives are more threatened.
Here's one of the armored vehicles. It looks primitive, but we had to build them ourselves. We lined the cabs entirely with lead to protect our soldiers from the radiation as best we could.
Each metallic piece of the structure is prefabricated, sometimes hundreds of miles away, then brought one by one onto the site for assembly. An extraordinary jigsaw puzzle. Beams 150 tons and 230 feet long, buttresses 150 feet high. Despite the extreme conditions, work progresses. 130,000 cubic yards of cement are used to make the structure. But the discovery of a new